much. Helen.
Okay, thanks. I think in terms of the priorities of the devolved powers, as PIP, as disability benefits are the largest area, I would agree that that's the priority to look at initially. I mean, there are three kind of key areas of PIP that we'd think that you should focus on. One is around the rates of the benefits, given that there's only two payable rates, and it's essentially excluding and getting rid of the lower mobility rate, which we think needs to be looked at as a priority and has an impact on mobility as a consequence. The other areas would be the quality in terms of the involvement of the private sector, of the assessors, both in the way that they handle the assessments for the individuals involved. I'm sure that committee members have all got horror stories and cases from their constituents on that, but how that affects in terms of the decision making when that comes back to people working in the DWP, looking at those decisions to get from assessment providers. I think that needs to be reviewed. Now, our belief is that the work should be brought back into the public sector, but also that the whole system needs to be reviewed to allow the staff processing the benefit to use and develop their skills and knowledge of the system rather than just going on what an assessment provider says, which is the current situation. In terms of structure and staffing, structure, we believe there needs to be a full choice in how claimants can access services, both in terms of disability and health benefits, but also across the board. Staffing, we strongly believe that it's a key area to look at. There needs to be adequate staffing. You might be aware that DWP has cut 30,000 staff since 2010, and that's not because the work has been dropping. It's the kind of the largest welfare reform in the history of the department, yet they've cut that number of staff. The adequate and fair treatment of staff needs to be considered as well, because the DWP is a hostile employer towards its staff. The other key area I think needs to be looked at is what's not really included within the consultation questions, what the Scottish Government could do to mitigate the worst elements of welfare reform in either top-up benefits or reviewing what they can do to support claimants through the system.
Helen Flanagan, do you want to come in?
Yes. In terms of involvement of the private sector in PIP, I mean, it did exist within DLA as well, but as you said, it was largely a paper exercise. And you're right, it is face-to-face assessments. What we experience, our members, just to remind the committee that we represent the vast majority of people working in the DWP, which is about 54,000 people in the UK. What they experience a lot is that they receive a form coming back from that assessment, which is a PA3 or PA4 to be technical, and that may not have enough information. Then they have to send that back to the assessor to carry out the assessment again, not face-to-face, but do the work, then come back to the individual who does the processing, which again is another cost, which is something that, and more time for the claim to go through, which is not fair on the individual claiming. It's surprising really that Atos and Capita were given these contracts, given their history with the WCA, and John has obviously given quite a few examples of the disastrous impact there for people claiming benefit, but people around the table will also be aware of the huge backlogs that happened when PIP was set up, sometimes going on for 8 to 12 months, that people were having to wait whilst that assessment took place. The other point to make in terms of assessments and the private sector as well is that when an individual makes a claim to personal independence payment and they want to provide additional evidence because they fear that assessment won't be adequate or full enough, that they are required to pay for that medical evidence themselves, which again is going to have a detrimental impact on people with low income. As I said in my opening comments, our position is that this work should be brought back into the public sector. It's absolutely abhorrent that there are companies making a lot of money out of this and a lot of money out of people waiting and a lot out of people's suffering. If there is to be an assessment system, that could be done within the public sector, within the NHS, and then processed by people working for the government. So that's our experience from members working in the DWP, and that's our position on that.
Helen Flanagan, do you want to come in on that particular one?
That's a question.
Yes, and then Dave Moxham and Jim to answer Adam Tompkins' question.
Okay, I'll just try and be brief. The welfare charter concept that we referred to in our submission is something that we go into greater detail on in our response to the public consultation. And we have PCS, Unite Community, represent unemployed workers, and the unemployed worker centres combined have put together a welfare charter public document which sets out some ideas that the Scottish Government could look at and consider. Within that, there are, well, as detailed in the submission, at the heart, and it goes back to what we were talking about at the outset, at the heart of social security system should be the desire to eradicate poverty and lift people out of poverty. But also within that should be clear rights for claimants. So one of the concepts there would be a claimant's ombudsman, how claimants can get help through the system, but also the right to fair and decent work and not being pushed into precarious work as well. I mean, there is a DWP customer charter. I'm not sure people are aware of that, but it isn't really something that is very strong, or that's something that individuals can rely on. So we're talking about something much stronger, both for the Scottish Government and for people administering the system, but also for the people claiming the benefits.
I think Helen had wanted to come in on that earlier, and then Dave, did you want to come in?
Yeah. Thank you. In terms of the question around employability and the work programme and sanction, I think it's reasonable to say that the work programme in the UK was a disaster and a huge waste of public funds. It didn't work for the vast majority of people who were put through the work programme. I think 70% returned to the DWP afterwards. All the data we've got shows that between 2011 and 2014, only 3% of the 1.5 million who referred to the work programme found lasting work, and only 18% found at least 3 months or 6 months work from that. It also had high levels of sanctioning. So if you compare periods, data for the same periods, that people were found to be 5 times more likely to be sanctioned than there were in 1 year alone, 2014, than there were to find a job from 2011 to 2014. So it was ineffective, but there were high sanction levels with it. So, I mean, there's lots of other research and data you could look at which proves and establishes that sanction is an effective way to get people into work, and I think that's largely agreed by many around this table, and we were pleased to see that that's something that the Minister also said in her recent appearance at this committee. So we would welcome the Scottish Government progressing what I think they've already indicated as recently as yesterday in removing the conditionality from the employability side of things. It's a shame that the powers don't go further, so that you couldn't look at removing conditionality and sanction from the employment system as a whole, but we think that needs to be looked at. I think in the comments made about the work programme, I was going to ask to come in about employability, because I think that shows as well that using the private sector and third sector isn't an effective way of doing that. There's data to show that people would be more likely to have found work if they didn't have any support from the work programme at all. So we believe that a better employability system would be delivered by the public sector, and in the range of ways that could be done. It could be done within job centres if they were better resourced and people were allowed to support people better. It could be delivered by skills development. Scotland, there are a whole ranges of options within that. I just want to comment very briefly on about DWP engagement, because there was a question, and given that we represent people who work there, I thought it would be relevant for me to answer that. Dave Moxham is entirely correct that from the Scottish ministers we have had engagement as a union who represents people who work in DWP. However, you probably won't be surprised to hear that from the other side, from DWP, has been very, very little engagement, both with the union and with the staff working in DWP in the UK and in Scotland specifically. It's quite a worrying time for people who work for DWP because it's just so unclear to them what it means in terms of devolvement. So I think, if anything, if you could look into that and encourage, you don't have powers over the DWP to step up that. Thanks.
Helen Flanagan.
I'll try. I think that from the staff perspective, I think I probably will start with, I think there has to be a complete redesign in terms of how the agency would be structured, look at kind of the terms and conditions involved. We are pleased to hear the Minister's idea about co-production. We're in discussion with civil servants about what that might mean, and it's something that we're exploring so that staff have a key part in designing the system and the structures and how it would work in terms of the benefits themselves. I think it's going to be difficult to address some of the cultural problems that arise from the DWP because it's only going to be partially devolved, and for the main of it, the front-facing side of the benefits system is still going to be under the DWP in the form of job centres, and the majority of working age benefits, of course, are reserved with the DWP. So I think where possible, having access to DWP front-facing officers would be a benefit. So having some kind of front-facing element of the Social Security Agency. Now, that doesn't mean setting up necessarily new workplaces. One thing DWP is looking at as part of its overall kind of body of work at the minute is co-location. Now, some of that is arising because of mass office closures that are on the horizon from the DWP, but having a positive influence within the DWP workplace, I think, would be a start of that. But for the main of it, I think it would be that looking at the co-production, having that involvement in designing the system, ensuring that there are fair working conditions, adequate staffing, and fair policies for people working within the department. Because as has been said before, you can't really hope that you'd have the users treated with dignity and respect if those delivering the services aren't also treated in that way.